Hello, my name is Alex. I'm a ranger at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site. I'm going to go over the talk today, and the talk itself is going to be about the wounds of the Civil War. It's going to kind of try to focus on the mental, physical, and emotional wounds that the veterans dealt with during the war, but focusing more on how they tried to deal with those after the war. So before we get into talking about any kind of wound, I want to go over some bit of an overview of the Civil War itself, some of the larger points that can potentially be reasons or causes for these wounds to occur in the veterans later in life. So back in 1860, on November 6th, the first Republican president was elected, and that was Abraham Lincoln. December of that same year, South Carolina succeeds from the Union, being the first state to do so. Now, jumping into 1861, we had in January, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all succeeding from the Union. And things after that succession stayed relatively the same up until April 12th, 1861, when Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter, officially beginning the Civil War. On April 15th that same year, Lincoln tries to bolster the Army's strength with more volunteer troops, and then Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee all succeed because of this. On June 20th, West Virginia became the 35th state in the Union after succeeding away and breaking away from Virginia. July 21st, we saw the Battle of Bull Run. The battle was fought near Manassas, Virginia. The Union Army under General Irwin McDowell initially succeeded in driving back the Confederate forces under General Pierce Gustave Toussaint Beauregard. Nailed it. But the arrival of troops under General Joseph E. Johnston initiates a series of reverses that sends McDowell's army in a panic retreat to the defense of Washington. And on August 10th, the United States Army under General Nathan Land attacks Confederate troops in the state militia southwest of Springfield, Missouri. After a disastrous day that included the death of Lyon, Confederate forces repel the Federal attack. The defeat emphasizes to the U.S. leaders that the strong Confederate presence west of the Mississippi River. Now, jumping from 1861, we're going to move on to 1862. And over March 8th and March 9th, we had the battles of Hampton Roads. The Battle of Hampton Roads pits the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, the old USS Merrimack, the first two ironclads fighting against one another off of the coast of Virginia. On March 8th, the CSS Virginia destroyed two wooden-hulled Federal ships, and on March 9th, the USS Monitor arrived and the two ironclads fought for hours, with neither inflicting much damage onto the other. July 17th, President Lincoln approves the Confiscation Act of 1862, or the Second Confiscation Act. This act expands the terms of the previous Confiscation Act, and it allows for broader seizure of Confederate property, the emancipation of enslaved people in federally occupied territory, and it prohibits the return of fugitive slaves. On September 17th, the bloodiest single day of the Civil War occurred, and that was the Battle of Antietam. The results of the battle ends Confederate General Lee's first invasion of the North. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. The Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure that declared enslaved people in rebelling states to be free, authorized the enlistment of black troops, and outraged white Southerners. The proclamation was an important turning point of the war for the United States, and it eventually shifted from the goal of restoring the Union as it was to building a better Union without slavery. From April 30th up until May 6th, U.S. General Joseph Hooker's plan to flank Lee's falls apart during the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, Lee attempts to break through, and his loss causes Union forces to retreat. Lee's victory at Chancellorsville is marred by high casualties, including the mortal wounding of Stonewall Jackson, who dies later on May 10th. Soon after, Lee asked Jefferson Davis for permission to invade the North and take the war out of Virginia. July 1st through the 3rd, we had the Battle of Gettysburg, often referred to as the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. And this battle dashes Robert E. Lee's hopes for a successful invasion of the North. On July 30th, General Order 252 declared that for any U.S. prisoner killed in violation of the laws of war, a Confederate prisoner would be killed in exchange. The prisoner exchange system is effectively suspended based on this general order. In September, from September 19th to the 20th, the U.S. Army started the Battle of Chickamauga. The U.S. Army of the Cumberland under General William Rosecrans is defeated and nearly routed by Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Braxton Bragg. Rosecrans' army retreats to the supply base at Chattanooga, Tennessee, and on November 19th of 1863, Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address. It's a dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg. Now, moving on to 1864, February 27th, 1864, we had the opening of Andersonville Prison. Camp Sumter Prison opens and becomes notorious for overcrowding, and it is then referred to as Andersonville. May 7th of that same year, Sherman starts his march towards Atlanta. November 8th, we see President Lincoln become reelected, and November 16th of that same year, Sherman starts his march towards the sea. Moving into 1865, on April 9th, we see the Battle of Appomattox. After an early morning attempt to break through the Federal forces blocking the route to Danville, Virginia, Lee seeks an audience with General Grant to discuss terms. That afternoon, in the parlor of Wilmer McLean, Lee signs the document of surrender. On April 12th, the Army of Northern Virginia formally surrenders and is disbanded. On April 14th, we have President Lincoln's assassination. President Lincoln was assassinated by actor John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. On the same day, Fort Sumter in South Carolina is reoccupied by U.S. troops. On April 15th, we see Andrew Johnson being sworn in as the 17th President of the United States, following Lincoln's assassination. On May 10th, we see Confederate President Jefferson Davis captured near Irwinville, Georgia. And on May 26th, with the surrender of the last large Confederate army, the Civil War officially ends. Confederate Brigadier General Stand Waite did not surrender until June 23rd, and one Confederate ship, the CSS Shenandoah, docked in Liverpool and surrendered to the Royal Navy on November 6, 1865, ending all of the sects of rebelling troops. Now, that's a little bit of the general overview of the Civil War itself and some events that will lead on to different suffrages that the veterans will be facing. But before we go into that, I want to kind of break down the Civil War itself more numerically for you. So here we have some of the different numbers, as I called it, for the Civil War based on different statistics taken by the Park Service. We have an estimated amount of a little over 2 million soldiers fighting for the Union and 880,000 soldiers fighting for the Confederacy. Now, it is worth noting that there is no exact number. Records weren't the primary focus being taken during the Civil War, so it's all estimations based on different readings and writings of people saying that they fought or things. So everything number-wise is sadly just estimates. Now, for the larger picture of all of it, an estimated about 2.5% of the U.S. population died during the Civil War. And if we were to lose about 2.5% of our population today, we would lose about 7 million people. So I think that puts a little bit more into perspective exactly how bloody this war really was. Now, based on the numbers we have here from the Park Service, they estimate that a total number of casualties from the Civil War was 1,125,453 people, with about 642,427 of those people being from the Union, and the remaining 483,026 being from the Confederacy. Now, from these total Union casualties, about 110,100 people died in battle. 224,580 are estimated to have died from diseases, and on the Confederate side, we have their total casualties being about 94,000 in battle and 164,000 dead of diseases. Diseases were running rampant between both the Union forces and the Confederate forces, with an estimate of about 66% of all deaths being from diseases instead of battle. Now, diseases did not only pass through the campsites and the battlefields, they were also very prominent in Civil War prisons. If you were captured during the Civil War, one of two things would have ended up happening to you. You could have been paroled on the field, or you could have been sent to a prison camp. Now, it was very common at the start of the war to parole prisoners, with around 211,411 Union soldiers being captured and 16,668 soldiers being paroled, whereas the Confederacy had 462,634 soldiers being captured, and the Union ended up paroling about 247,769 of those prisoners. Now, being paroled initially meant that you were being kept prisoner until a prisoner exchange was able to be made, and then once a prisoner exchange was able to be made, they would transfer prisoners over. There were different values associated with the rank that you held. Privates were traded with privates on a 1-to-1. Lieutenants would be worth 5 privates, and a general would be worth about 50 privates. So it had different ranking based on the number of people per rank. Now, once the prisoner exchange itself was stopped, prisoners started getting placed into these prisons. And the prisons that were being quickly constructed across both the Union and the Confederacy. The first prison I'd like to talk about is one that you've probably already heard me mention, and that is Andersonville. Now, here we do have a photo or a drawing of Andersonville itself. We have, I think it's a nice showing. There's no pointer, so I'll just awkwardly stand in front of you and point. But we do have it kind of broken down with the water source cutting right through the middle of the prison, and we have prisoners on either side of the water source. Also shows the very tall and large walls that surrounded the prison and encased it, making it difficult for people to actually escape. And I'm going to start off this with a quote of an Andersonville prison survivor. His name was Private A.S. Klein from the 63rd Regiment in New York. When I was taken prisoner, I weighed 165 pounds. And when I came out, I weighed 96 pounds and was considered stout to some that I saw there. Now, Andersonville Prison itself was located in Sumter County, Georgia, in the midst of Georgia's cotton and corn growing section. It was located in the town of Anderson, which was named after John W. Anderson, and it initially had a population of only about 20. Captain W. Sidney Winder was ordered in November of 1863 to find a location suitable for prisoners of war in the state of Georgia. The location was chosen because of its remoteness, and supplies could easily be brought in. Now, the official name was Camp Sumter, but for today we'll refer to it just as Andersonville, since that is its most commonly known name. Brigadier General Howard Cobb, Georgia's former governor, thought of his state to put in this new prison Construction began in January of 1864. The first prisoners ended up arriving in February 27th that same year. Original prisoners were shipped from Belle Island in the north and arrived to the unfinished prison, with prisoners providing their own shelters. So when they arrived, they had to build their own shelters to stay. The prison was thought to accommodate about 6,000, but would end up increasing to about 10,000 by Richard Winder, who was overseeing the construction. After it was complete, the camp could hold about 15,000 people, but at the highest point of its existence, the camp was listed as holding about 33,000 prisoners. When the prison was being built in early 1864, it encompassed about 16.5 acres and was surrounded by a 15-foot wall, which you can see in the photo here. The stockade was about 1,620 feet long and 779 feet wide. Inside the stockade walls was the deadline, a short wooden post topped with a single rail. If a prisoner passed over the deadline, he would be shot on the spot by the guards, or if the prisoner accidentally hit the stakes with their hand, they would also end up being shot. Now, it is estimated that the prisoners had about 42 square feet of space per man. There were also sentry boxes built where guards would be able to be stationed and look out across the stockade fences and see the prisoners themselves. In June of 1864, the prison stockade was enlarged to about 26.5 acres because of overcrowding. Now, even though 15,000 seems like a lot, the fact that at one point in time they had about 33,000 stationed there shows the issue that overcrowding ended up causing for the prison. Because of overcrowding, not only was there less space for the prisoners to be able to go out and do things, but they ran into issues with supplies. They were not getting enough supplies from the amount of people there. So what would end up happening is, instead of everyone being cared for, you'd have prisoners fighting each other to get the survivability supplies that they needed. So you end up having a lot of infighting among prisoners. As mentioned by Private A.S. Klein, many would starve, die from starvation, but outside of starvation, the weather, since you had to build your own shelter, and the guards, the most often and the highest killer was disease. The river running straight through, or creek or stream, I can't fully tell you based on the nice photo there, but the water source they had running through was often used by the prisoners as the latrine. So they'd use it for the restroom, and it was never cleaned or taken care of. So it would cause a cesspool for diseases to be able to grow, and that would spread throughout the prison, killing off a lot of prisoners. So diseases, prison guards, other prisoners, the weather conditions all added a lot of stressors onto these prisoners, and that ended up causing them a lot of issues both in the prison and affected them later on after being released. Now, the next prison I'm going to mention is Belle Island. Belle Island itself was originally a 54-acre island within the James River. It was close to the Confederate capital of Richmond. Belle Island itself was opened back in 1862, and it ran up until the end of the war in 1865. There were reports that more than 30,000 prisoners had made their way through the island. Modern historians estimate that there were about 1,000 deaths that occurred here on the island itself. There was no furniture for the prisoners, so just like at Andersonville, they were expected to create their own sites. They were forced to stay outside in their own homemade shelters. Now, just like with many of the prison camps going on, the prisoners themselves were mistreated. Now, this ranged from just the lack of shelter and the lack of supplies, whether from overcrowding or just the guards deciding to withhold those supplies from the prisoners. It also led into similar issues that Andersonville faced with infighting amongst the prisoners and the bad weather and diseases running rampant throughout. Now, according to the diary of a man named John Ransom, who was a soldier incarcerated there. Stormy and disagreeable weather from 15 to 20 and 25 die every day. And they are buried just outside of the prison with no coffins, nothing but canvas wrapped around them. And that was his entry for February 11th, 1864. Now, Ransom also does go on to imply that prisoners were robbing each other for different rations and blankets to help stay warm, mentioning that there was a lot of infighting among the men and described them as being like hungry wolves. Now, I don't want to focus just on prisons that were in the Confederate States, because there were also prisons for prisoners here in the Union. The first one I'm going to mention is a prison called Elmira Prison, but it was often referred to as Helmira by the different inhabitants. Now, Helmira itself was opened up in July of 1864. Confederate prisoners were forced to sleep out in the open with little or no shelter, very common trend that we're seeing amongst all of the prisons at the time. Overcrowding also became a major issue here at this prison. It was originally designed to hold about 4,000 prisoners, but it ended up exceeding that population size within a month of opening. It is estimated that within that first month to 2 months, there were about 10,000 prisoners living inside the walls. And by September of 1865, close to 3,000 prisoners, or an estimated 25% of the prisoners that made their way through the walls at Helmira, ended up dying. One of the reasons that there were so many deaths, just like with all the other ones, was diseases ended up running rampant throughout, as well as the infighting amongst different soldiers to get the supplies that they needed to make sure they could survive, and the lack of a latrine leading, as before, to the disease cesspool being able to easily spread throughout all of the prisoners. Now, unlike Andersonville, they had a couple of other forms of more unique punishment here at Elmira. They had what they called barrel shirts. It was a pretty popular form of punishment amongst the guards. Inmates who broke the rules would be made to wear a barrel, and on the front of the barrel they'd usually put up a list or paint a list of the different transgressions that this prisoner had committed and force them to walk around wearing it. There were also some jail cells built in that they would put a ton of prisoners in at one point in time for the different transgressions that they committed, causing for overcrowding in a small cell. Rations would often be cut off as a punishment. As Emerson pointed out, one of the camp commanders enjoyed cutting off the rations simply as retaliation for what was happening in the South at their prisons. And what I think is one of the more interesting things about Helmira is outside of the prison there was a large tower built up by the town itself, and local New Yorkers would end up paying 5 cents to go up to the top of this tower, and they could use that to look into Helmira Prison itself, basically turning it into a zoo. At the top of the tower they could really do anything they wanted, whether it was throw things at the prisoners, eat their lunch, and look out like they were at a zoo, and that ran on up until prison officials ended up getting fed up that someone was making money off the prison, so they took it over and ended up using it as an extra guard tower to overlook the prison itself. Now, we had a well-known prison here in Ohio known as Camp Chase. It was named after Samuel P. Chase, the former governor of Ohio, and he was Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln. This prison originally opened in 1861, originally only about to hold 300 prisoners. But by 1864, the prison population was estimated to be about 8,000. And by July of 1865, more than 26,000 prisoners have ended up passing through the doors at Camp Chase. Just like with all the other prisons, diseases ran rampant throughout the camp, and by the time the camp itself had closed, about 8% of the total prisoner population had died. So just like with all the other prisons that I've mentioned here and other ones that I have not mentioned, overcrowding, lack of supplies, diseases, infighting amongst the prisoners and the guards themselves all added a lot of stressors onto these individuals, making them unsure what was going to happen on a day-to-day and having them choose to do things that would later on affect them in life. Now, at the end of the war, all the prisons were closed. Everyone was then shipped back to their respective states. And the Union veterans who were there ended up getting to join in on all of the nice welcome home tour that they had, where veterans got to march down on D.C. and be celebrated for bringing the Union back together. Well, now I'm going to turn this to more focusing on how the veterans themselves tried to relive after being put through these hardships and how they tried to cope with returning to regular civilian life after the war. Now, how were Union veterans treated after the war? Well, outside of the large celebrations, like the ones we have photoed here, the walking through Washington, and a illustration of what they thought tents would look like for the celebration, soldiers were not really treated the best when they returned back to their individual homes. Whenever they marched through major cities, there would be small gatherings of people cheering them on, but every time they cut through a smaller town or made it back to their original town, there was really no one there to celebrate their return outside of their immediate family. So a lot of veterans felt hurt by the American people that are not more widely celebrated upon their return. And another issue with this is civilians believed that since they had ended up winning the Civil War and keeping the Union together, that these veterans would never know the taste of defeat or know any trauma of defeat. So they kind of viewed them as figures that would never be able to get down by anything that they uncover. They'd be able to overcome anything that they came in to contact with, since they already overcame the separation of the Confederacy. And this ended up leading into a lot of issues that soldiers faced after returning home to be dismissed, because they believe that since they've already overcome one hardship, they should have no issues overcoming any others. In some cases, it led to the people believing that there was nothing bad that could ever happen to these soldiers, since they already triumphed of what they saw as a living evil. Now, with all this in mind, it is worth re-noting that the soldiers were not treated poorly or received poorly on their return home. It's just that soldiers viewed that they were being seen or received through indifference. They weren't really too happy that they were back, but weren't too sad that they were gone. Many soldiers really took this as an affront to all the horrors that they had to witness to make sure that their lives were not upended. And just like the fighting that they had gone through to help preserve the Union, it made them question if their entire service was meaningless. Another issue that they ran into was stolen discharge papers. Now, as I mentioned very early on, there was not really a huge emphasis on record keeping during the Civil War. So once you were discharged, they would give you your discharge papers. And you holding on to the discharge papers was really the only way that you could prove that you actually served in the Civil War. It would get you any benefits that you might have qualified for, so it was very important that these soldiers held on to that. But that's not something that was widely told to these soldiers, so it's not something everyone really realized they needed to keep a hold of. And that ran into an issue that veterans had with what were referred to as discharge paper bandits. Now, these were people that would try any way in which they could to get the discharge papers from these veterans so they could claim any veterans' benefits that they would have had. Without the discharge papers, veterans had no evidence that they served in the Union Army outside of their own word, so swindlers tried to get these through a multitude of tactics. Alcohol, drugs, pickpocketing, etc. They would also just been known to try and buy them off of soldiers with a large sum of money so that they could have an even exchange, as they viewed it at the time, of money for papers, even though those papers will lead to more benefits, potentially more money later on. Now, there were a lot of other issues that veterans ended up facing with reintegration to home life after they came back from the Civil War. Now, even though the Civil War itself was over, veterans had to go through a lot of daily battles once they received back home. Many veterans felt that the receptions they got from their own hometowns were not becoming of the fighting that they had gone through. And on top of that, Many family members of veterans became quickly worried, saying that the people that returned home were not the ones that left, stating that they do not know who walked in their door, but it's not their husband or it's not their son. Now, while they were not aware of what PTSD really was at the time, but based on research today, it is believed that a lot of veterans during the Civil War ended up suffering from it. Many of the more common symptoms of PTSD that we see amongst these Civil War veterans were violent outbursts, erratic sleeping and eating patterns, suicidal acts and attempts, post-combat hypervigilance, and being constantly frightened, along with delusional paranoias, often raged amongst the top of what the doctors at the asylums were saying that these veterans were suffering from once they arrived. Now, I think what often gets overlooked, that outside of the horror of war that these men ended up having to go through, is that even though they're fighting the enemy, they were also fighting other Americans. It's not like wars today where we fight them in foreign soil. This was fully fought here in the United States. Sometimes cities or neighboring towns were split, some with the Union, some fighting for the Confederacy. So there were a lot of times that families would also be split because of this. So there was a larger chance that the soldiers in the Union knew exactly who they were fighting and had personal connections with those who they're fighting in the Confederacy, which adds into more of the despair, knowing exactly who you kill instead of it just being the enemy. And as mentioned earlier, with the public's overall view that they could not ever be untriumphant after overcoming all these horrors, many of the issues that veterans talked about were just swept underneath the rug, viewing it as something that they'll just get over within time. Now, on top of issues that they received from trying to reintegrate back in, there was a lack of benefits that a lot of veterans viewed, and they wanted to kind of fight to have better benefits to help themselves and their families survive. The main benefit that they tried to fight for was for a nice pension to actually help live. Now, pictured here, we actually have the pension card for Lucretia Garfield after James Garfield's death. Has her classified as a widow, has James Garfield's death, the number of the application, the certificate number after it was approved. And what I like to point out that I think is pretty interesting, if you look underneath additional services, they have written President of the United States, seeing it as more of an extra thing that he had done, not as the high accomplishment that it really was. Now, the pension breakdown itself worked out more of this way at the beginning, is officers would receive $30 a month if they were injured during the war and released because of the injury, and privates would receive $8 a month. Widows who lost their husbands in the fighting would also receive a pension, but that pension was only the amount that their husband would have received. So if your husband was a private, you would only receive $8 as the pension. If he was a officer, you'd receive about $30 a month. Now, to receive the pension, veterans needed proper documentation to prove that they were soldiers fighting in the Civil War. They also need documentation proving that they were injured fighting in the Civil War. And this is where a lot of veterans ran into issues. The common theme you might have noticed throughout these last couple slides is they did not do a good job documenting the Civil War. So a lot of people ran into the issues of there being no documentation that they served if they lose their discharge papers. There was no documentation that they were injured in battle, whether it was doctors lost the paperwork, didn't bother filling it out because they had to deal with so many wounded, or in some cases, the records were just damaged and destroyed. Now, the pensions were originally only given to the widows and wounded vets, but if you're not able to prove that you are a wounded vet or a widow, you would not receive the pension at all. And receiving it proved to be difficult even if you had all the proper documentation. Now, one of the issues they ran into with losing the medical documentation on the battlefield is if their position ended up getting overrun by Confederate forces and they pulled out, what the Confederate forces would often do was burn down the sites, which would then lose all of the information there. And just the lack of information, the real lack of documenting exactly what happened to these individuals really ended up causing them a lot of problems trying to claim this pension that so many of them needed to be able to survive with their day-to-day lives. One of the things that veterans fought for afterwards was just respect from the American people, based on the lack of celebration shown when they got to their smaller towns, and in the way that it seemed people so quickly got past the Civil War and acted like it did not happen. They felt like they were not respected at all for the sacrifices that they made, or that everything that they had done was just being dismissed by the American public. Because of this, a lot of veterans ended up becoming upset, wondering what was the purpose of them even fighting to maintain the Union. It is worth noting that a lot of the citizens of the Union at this time didn't want to do anything that would potentially reignite any of the issues between the North and the South, because it was a very large overhanging issue that there is a chance, depending on how things turn out shortly after the Civil War, that the South might break off again and succeed, and we might go into another Civil War. So the citizens didn't want to do anything that would help lead to the fracturing of the newly reformed Union, but in doing so, it did end up giving disrespect to those who had served. Now, with the issues of reintegration and trying to fight for different benefits that you were entitled to, a lot of veterans had issues just coping and going back to civilian life. And along with these issues, there are ways in which they tried to make it easier for themselves. One of the ways was just getting back to work. Veterans who did not qualify for the pensions or that were having issues trying to get the pension decided to try and find a job themselves so that they could help support themselves and their family. Now, an issue so many ran into is when they returned back, their old jobs were already taken up by new workers because they needed someone who could do the work in the meantime. So if they were not able to find a job in the field that they were trained in beforehand, they were forced to relearn how to do a new job and try to find a new way of work, which proved to be very difficult for some of these older veterans who had put so much of their life into learning a trade and then could no longer find work in that trade. And getting a job in general just turned out to be very difficult for veterans themselves, but especially for injured veterans or amputees. Anyone who lost a leg had to walk around with a crutch or the nice peg leg they were given as a substitute would have to find jobs that would require a lot of sitting, not too much movement, and there were not a lot of jobs like that being offered at the time. And any veteran who ended up losing the use of one of their arms had to find a job that would not require too much strenuous manual labor, since they were now more of a liability than an asset for that. And if you lost the use of your dominant arm, before you could even think about trying to work, you had to figure out if learning how to make your non-dominant arm your new dominant arm was something you could even do. So a lot of issues they faced into, so work wasn't always the easiest way of trying to reintegrate back into everyday life, but it was something that if the veteran was able to do so, it helped them out tremendously. If work didn't end up happening because of unable to find it, injuries, a lot ended up turning to the bottle or just becoming alcoholics. Now, they turned to it more to deal with the problems they faced during the war and the problems they faced on the home front, unable to find work to support their family. It was a very common sight, or written as being a common sight by people, of seeing veterans out in the street, drinking in bars, causing fights with different citizens in the area. These fights would usually end up having to be broken up by the police, or in some cases, if one of their commanding officers or former commanding officers were in the area, they'd be able to help break it up. Usually ending with a quote that these men have seen more horrors than you could ever imagine. You would not be able to take them down with just your clubs. Now, these public outbursts with veterans drinking ended up adding to the negative images an image that was given to veterans upon their return. And it also caused an issue when groups of veterans were traveling through cities with public officials in several cities, like Baltimore, Harrisburg, and Jackson, Michigan, were stated as taking every precaution by criminalizing the sale of intoxicating liquors to the returning troops. So they were trying to do what they could to help limit the impact of drunk veterans throughout their towns. Now, there were other ways in which veterans tried to return and cope with the return, and one of the ways was by writing. A lot of veterans ended up writing and added it as a new part of their everyday lifestyle after leaving. They would write their experience both in the battle for the wars and write about their experience trying to cope with no longer being a soldier. A lot would try to write memoirs and sell off memoirs to try and make a living instead of trying to find a job if they could not find a job. And others just wrote in their diaries to try to have an outlet for the different things they're feeling that no one around seemingly had any kind of notice to. Memoirs and the diaries were the two typical ways in which they tried to write about their experiences. And the memoirs, they saw a lot of veterans send them off to try and get published, with many of them being rejected. It unfortunately seemed like to these veterans, the Civil War had kind of passed and was no longer in the forefront of the people's minds, so not everyone wanted to read about their horrors like they were hoping to create an income. And while writing was a way in which veterans were able to work and try to get through things on their own, they also met up with their own veteran groups, whether it was their regiments meeting back up for meetings or just to talk with each other, or other organizations set up for prisoners of war, amputees of the war. There were a lot of different groups that were made up for these veterans to be able to talk with one another. And an example of this group is the Ohio Ex-Prisoners of War Association. They were an organization of ex-prisoners of war that would meet annually to talk about their experiences and other ways in which they could try to explain their experiences to other people. Many prisoners of war viewed themselves as being very similar to their disabled brothers, stating that they are also living witnesses and should be able to leave their testimony before they go. These groups were also known for traveling or making pilgrimages back to places where they had been before during the Civil War. Forts, battlefields, prisons were all visited by these individuals, just trying to find any item that they could take home with them to add to their overall collection. Screws, parts of tables, sides of shacks from prisons, hairbrushes, muskets, anything that they could find and get their hands of would be taken home with them after these expeditions, and they'd be added to their personal collections or their own Civil War memorabilia. Veterans were also known from time to time when they met up at these annual meetings to bring these items with them to show to other veterans and then use that to help explain their experiences a little bit better. I will mention that pictured right here, we have the 29th Wisconsin Infantry at one of their reunions with family and friends, taken in the 1880s, after about 20 or so years after the Civil War. So that is still how large of a pool that the regimental programs were bringing for these veterans. Now, there were attempts by the American people to try and help veterans, and one of the main attempts was newspaper contests. Now, it could be looked in one way as just newspapers being seen as a little lazy, trying to have veterans write stories for them to then be able to publish and not have to do the research themselves. But they often put contests out and had a monetary value associated with it. So if you were the chosen article, you would receive payment. So it was a way in which veterans were able to receive some kind of income afterwards and get their stories out there for the public to be able to read. Now, these newspapers would often receive hundreds of responses and would typically only be able to choose one or two as the winners. It would provide the newspapers with the story, but it also did end up upsetting a lot of the veterans that were not chosen, wondering if their experience were just not being validated. Occasionally, there were contests that were also put in place specifically for disabled vets, like the left-handed manuscript contest. Now, the left-handed manuscript contest was instituted by a man named William Olin Bourne. The applicants to this contest would have to prove that they were amputated during the war and that they are currently using their non-dominant hand to write. Once those papers, along with their manuscripts, had made its way through, they would be reviewed by a panel of 3 judges, and the winner was selected, and then that winner would receive a monetary prize. They had such a large amount of veterans sending in to this left-handed manuscript contest that he announced that they would do another one the next year. There are around 300 applicants that sent in for the first contest, and when he announced it for the next year, he also put on a prize of $500 in premiums that these veterans could receive. His goal was to try and make a book of all the different manuscripts that are being sent in and sell the book. After he sold the book, he also wrote into the terms of the contest that once the book was made, he would give it to these veterans as a gift, free of charge. Now, for the $500 in premium, it was split amongst the top 10 different manuscripts. So depending on if you were first or second, down to 10th, it would dictate the amount of money you got from these overall winnings, but it had a larger pool to choose from instead of the original contest. Now, one of the important things to note with this left-handed manuscript contest is it also gave amputated veterans the kick in the pants some of them needed to start learning how to use their non-dominant hand. It led into a resurgence of writing amongst the veterans that had not done before, and it actually ended up having a lot of them become very familiar with using a hand that they had not really used before losing their dominant one. So it had a very positive effect into that group of veterans. Now, the veteran support groups, kind of like the veteran groups mentioned beforehand, would often rent out a lot of different union halls. These spaces were just areas that once every few months would be rented out, and it would allow veterans to be able to go and talk to other veterans and individuals that had shared experiences so that they could talk about things bothering them with others, learn about their experiences, and just be able to share in a space where everyone was understanding of the things that they had gone through. Meetings were also held to go over different ways in which veterans would be able to kind of petition the government to receive better benefits, like the livable pension mentioned earlier, to try and help support their families and the families of their comrades who had died in battle. Another thing that became very prominent were states and towns started to create asylums for veterans. Now, the asylum moniker was eventually changed to being soldiers' homes or veterans' homes, but they were originally referred to as asylums. That change did not happen until the 1870s. The initial thought behind having these asylums is that it would help provide veterans of the Civil War a place to live and help get them off the streets, since so many were being found homeless, living out on their own. There are multiple reports of the public misconduct of the veterans, which also helped add into why they felt this was a very needed expenditure. It was primarily initially made for veterans who were disabled and those who could not support themselves, as well as veterans who had just mentally broken down. They would be moved into these asylums and taken care of by a paid staff run by the state, and each of these facilities offered different things veterans would be able to do. And examples of veterans living in this asylum would be a man named Paul Lindenberg of the 61st Illinois Volunteer Infantry. Paul ended up moving into the northwestern branch of the asylum, or the National Asylum, after being in its first year, and that was found in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He wrote about his experiences living in the home, saying that there were plenty of things to be worried about at the National Asylum. Gluttonous bed bugs that invaded the barracks each summer, the thick, foul-smelling air made worse by the summering heat, the sour bread, rancid meat, tasteless coffee being served in the dining halls, the bands of inmates that would roam around the halls, helping themselves to razors, poach's stance, and the insufferable moans of the emanated from the home hospital. However, the thing that distressed Lindenberg the most was that he and every veteran who lived here occupied a wretched middle ground, an uneasy space between the dead and the living, the past and the present, the meaning and the inconsequence. Now, he was not the only veteran to have these thoughts. Many men wrote talking about how they were tired of the monotony of their daily routines and likened the asylum to a prison instead of a home. Because of this, there was a large amount that were in the asylum that wanted to go back to trying to live independently, and many veterans did try to leave the asylum as quickly as possible because of that. For those that left, a large portion of them ended up reapplying to be housed in an asylum again because they could not handle living out on their own. Others tried to take advantage of the Homestead Act and move out west to try and make their own way out there. And some that did not want to return back to the asylum but could not take care of themselves ended up committing suicide because they would rather die than return back to the asylum and not be on their own. Now, those are just some of the ways in which, at the time, people tried to help these veterans, and luckily we have made strides in doing a better job at helping veterans coming back today, many of which were helped and instituted based on things that we saw during the Civil War. So some of the ways in which we've tried to improve and have help for veterans today are organizations like AMVETS. AMVETS is committed to service, and it traces its roots back to 1944 when the veteran volunteers first began helping veterans of World War II obtain the benefits that were promised to them by the federal government. As the number of returning veterans swelled into the millions, it was evident that some sort of nationally recognized organization needed to be created, and less than 3 years had gone by since 1944. In 1947, President Truman signed into public law 216, making AMVETS the first World War II organization to be chartered by Congress. We also have the Department of Veterans Affairs. Now, the Department of Veterans Affairs can actually date its roots back all the way to the Revolutionary War, with the pension laws passed by the Continental Congress at the time for those who had fought in the Revolutionary War. Now, after passing those laws, they did leave it up to the state to help distribute the relief. And after 1789, the federal government stepped in and assumed responsibility for the pension system. And in the early 1800s, a small office of 3 in the War Department ended up handling the clerical work that was related to the claims of the few thousand veterans on the pension roll. The Veterans Health Administration, a section of the Department of Veterans Affairs, was also helping out veterans, and it can date itself back to the first federal soldiers' facilities that were established during the Civil War for veterans of the Union Army. On March 3rd, 1865, a month before the Civil War ended, and the day before his second inauguration, President Abraham Lincoln signed a law to establish a National Soldiers and Sailors Asylum. He renamed it as the National Home for Disabled Veterans Soldiers. That's what it was renamed back in 1873. And it was the first government instituted, or first ever government institution created specifically for honorably discharged volunteer soldiers. And the first national homes opened back in November, as talked about a little bit earlier. These asylums or soldiers template for the veterans hospitals that they're using today. Now, the GI Bill itself is probably one of the more important things that the Department of Veterans Affairs oversees today. The GI Bill was signed into law on June 22nd, 1942, and it guarantees that loans be given to veterans. These loans can be used to purchase a home or used to pay for a higher education. The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that from 1944 through December of 1933, the VA guaranteed 13.9 million home loans valued at more than $433.1 billion. And finally, the last organization I'd like to talk about is a more recent organization, and that is the Wounded Warriors Project. Now, this project began back in 2003 as a small grassroots effort providing simple care and comfort items to the hospital bedsides of the first wounded service members returning home from conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. As their post-service needs evolved, so have the programs being run by the Wounded Warriors. Today, through their programs in mental health, career counseling, and long-term rehabilitative care, along with their advocacy efforts, they are able to positively impact the lives of millions of veterans and their families. And programs like the Wounded Warrior Project focus on helping new soldiers returning home and returning easier into civilian life, and they primarily strive to help veterans with more of their invisible wounds, like PTSD, brain damage, and depression. Now, there are some other ways in which things have improved, focusing more with a darker topic like alcoholism. There are groups now like Alcoholics Anonymous that help veterans and anyone who is struggling with alcoholism to stop drinking or stop drinking as heavily to allow them to have a better life. And based on recent statistics from the Army, it showed that about 22% of reported hazardous or drinking or heavy drinking were from soldiers. Heavy drinking for them was defined as having more than 4 drinks per day or 14 drinks within the week for men, and more than 3 drinks a day and 7 per the week for women. And the statistics that they found showed that service members are more likely to abuse alcohol than civilians, particularly in levels of binge drinking. So it's a good thing that the statistics are showing that it is a problem, unlike during the Civil War, where it was just viewed as something that they were choosing to do, and organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous are in place to be able to help individuals suffering from those issues. And finally, based on some current studies, I'd like to talk a little bit more about PTSD. Current studies today show that at some point in their life, 7 out of every 100 veterans, or about 7%, will end up suffering from PTSD. And for the general population, it is shown that about 6% will suffer from PTSD in their lifetime. PTSD is also found to be more common among female veterans, with about 13% suffering, versus male veterans, only about 6% suffering. And here, I'll end it with this nice table of the war or service and the percentage showing the increase in which PTSD is having effect on soldiers. World War II and Korean War saw about 2% for more recently still suffering from PTSD, and 3% of all surviving soldiers from those wars ended up saying that they have suffered at some point in their lifetime from PTSD. Vietnam War seen within the last year about 5% of veterans suffering from PTSD still, and 10% stating that they have suffered from it at some point in their life. Persian Gulf War, or just Desert Storm as it was more commonly referred to, saw about 14% of veterans dealing with PTSD within the last year, and 21% dealing with it at some point in their life. And finally, with Operation Iraq Freedom and Ending Freedom, we see that about 15% of veterans have been suffering from PTSD within the last year, and 29% have suffered from PTSD at some point in their life. But unlike back in the Civil War, since we did not really have any basis for mental health, we are able to better help the veterans here today, which I believe is represented by the fact that the percentage of those who have suffered at some point is not as high as the ones that have suffered in the last year, showing that they are working in a positive trend downward, being able to better help those veterans upon their return home. So that is the end of what I have for you.
All right, thanks so much for your attention.